Hey there, friend. Welcome back, or maybe welcome for the first time, to another late-night history ramble. Tonight, we're not diving into another tale of kings who couldn't stop marrying their cousins, or queens who cried into velvet cushions because their portraits lied about how pretty they were. No, tonight, we're leaving the drafty halls of power and heading down into the muddy streets, the smoky taverns, and the noisy festival squares of medieval Europe. Because sometimes, you've just got to ask, what exactly did ordinary people, peasants, townsfolk, maybe the occasional wandering monk with bad shoes, actually do for fun? Now, fun might feel like a modern invention. Like surely nobody between the years 500 and 1500 CE ever cracked a smile, unless it was to laugh at someone falling into a cesspit. But the truth is, medieval people had plenty of entertainment. Was it always wholesome? No. Did it sometimes involve dead animals? Unfortunately, yes. But it kept them busy, and, more importantly, it gave them stories to pass on, songs to sing, and occasional bruises that took months to heal. So let's settle in. Dim the lights, pull that blanket a little tighter, and relax your shoulders. Tonight's lullaby is brought to you by drunken village football matches, questionable street theater, and a whole lot of church-approved mischief. Let's start with the most universal pastime, music. If you're picturing a medieval bard strumming a lute in the corner of a tavern, congratulations, you've been brainwashed by Hollywood. Yes, there were traveling musicians, sometimes called minstrels, jongleurs, or troubadours, depending on where you were. But everyday music was basically everywhere. People sang while working in fields, sang during feasts, sang while drunk, sang while sad, sang while probably dying of the plague. The tunes weren't all about knights in shining armor either. Sure, noble courts commissioned love songs about unattainable ladies with suspiciously high foreheads, but peasants? Their songs were more like, hey, life's miserable, let's sing about ale. One surviving song from the 13th century literally has the lyrics, "Bring us ale, bring us ale, bring us ale." And honestly, that could be an anthem in any college town today. Instruments weren't limited to lutes either. Drums, bagpipes, fiddles, flutes, and even hurdy-gurdies. Yes, the cranky instrument that sounds like a swarm of angry bees were part of the soundtrack. Bagpipes especially weren't some Scottish monopoly. They were all over Europe. Imagine your local medieval street corner. Instead of someone blasting lo-fi beats from a Bluetooth speaker, you'd have some guy wheezing away on bagpipes until dogs howled. Now, let's slide over to another favorite, games. And I don't mean games as in neatly organized sports with referees and whistles. I mean games as in, what chaotic nonsense can we all do to burn energy before winter kills half of us? First up, medieval football. Not the polite, rule-bound thing you watch on TV. No, this was a rolling, screaming, muddy mob of peasants, sometimes hundreds of them, all trying to shove a leather ball from one end of the village to the other. The goalposts could be miles apart, like from one church to another, and the field of play was everything in between. Fields, fences, streams, houses, your grandmother's garden, fair game. There were no teams, really. Just whoever lives on this side of the village versus whoever lives on that side of the village. It was part sport, part riot, part free chiropractic adjustment when someone shoved you into a wall. Which, to be fair, is a pretty decent reason. But bans didn't work. People just kept playing. Because, let's be honest, if your daily life is shoveling dung, hauling water, and paying taxes to a lord who has never worked a day in his life, then yes, you're going to chase that pig bladder like your life depends on it. Speaking of questionable sports, let's drift towards something more violent. Animal games. Now, this is the part where medieval entertainment gets a little darker. People really loved to pit animals against each other. Bears chained to posts, baited by dogs, cocks trained for fighting, bulls teased until they gored somebody in the crowd. Was this fun? Apparently yes. Was it good for the animals? Obviously not. But in a world before Netflix, people would gather for hours to watch it. And if that wasn't enough, sometimes the fun involved dead animals, like tossing animal bladders around or playing with bones. Yes, medieval childhood wasn't exactly a Fisher-Price catalog. But before you imagine every peasant as a sadistic beast tormentor, remember that people also adored their working animals. Oxen, donkeys, horses. They just had a very different sense of where play ended and cruelty began. Let's pull away from the violence and stroll into something lighter. Storytelling. In a world with almost no books, unless you were a monk who could afford to ruin his eyesight by candlelight, stories traveled by word of mouth. Around the fire, in taverns, during long winter nights, people told fables, folk tales, and weird local legends. A favorite genre? Trickster stories. About foxes outsmarting wolves, peasants outsmarting lords, and clever wives outsmarting their husbands. Basically, the medieval version of sitcoms. And when people weren't listening, they were performing. Mummers' plays, little amateur dramas put on by villagers, were common. Imagine your neighbors dressing up in paper crowns, wooden swords, and ragged costumes, putting on a play about St. George fighting a dragon. Spoiler, the dragon was usually just a guy under a green blanket. And the best part? The plays were often bawdy. Yes, the church frowned on dirty jokes, and yes, people made them anyway. Medieval humor was, earthy, let's say. Jokes about bodily functions, about lusty monks, about cuckolded husbands with horns. If you thought Monty Python invented silly medieval humor, no, they just recycled it. Another huge part of fun came through festivals. The church calendar was basically a medieval party planner. Almost every month had a saint's feast day, and those were excuses for parades, music, dancing, and eating slightly better food than usual. The biggest blowout was Carnival, the chaotic days before Lent, where people dressed in costumes, reversed roles, mocked authority, and generally behaved like the Middle Ages version of Mardi Gras. Imagine the poorest peasant for one day pretending to be the Pope. Imagine the Pope pretending to be a peasant. People wore masks, sang parody songs, and ate enough meat to make their local priest nervous. Yes, it was technically blasphemous. Yes, people loved it anyway. And of course, we can't forget about taverns. Alcohol wasn't just a pastime. It was basically liquid safety. Water wasn't always clean, so ale, cider, or weak wine were everyday drinks. Which means, yes, people were kind of tipsy most of the time. Taverns were the social hubs. Gossip, singing, card games, dice games, arguments, romances, fistfights, they all happened there. One popular dice game was literally called Hazard, which tells you everything you need to know about it. Another was called Tables, an ancestor of backgammon. And of course, people gambled on these games, because why not risk losing your only chicken for exchange for bragging rights? So, to sum up this little tour, fun in the Middle Ages wasn't elegant. It was messy, loud, sometimes violent, often ridiculous, and always communal. People found joy wherever they could, whether in a drunken song, a chaotic street brawl disguised as football, or a bawdy story told around the fire. And remember, these weren't special occasions. This was life. Fun wasn't separate from work. It was mixed into the rhythm of seasons, harvests, festivals, and faith. But don't get too comfortable just yet, because in the next part, we're going to peek a little deeper into weddings, funerals, and the strange ways people turned life's biggest milestones into opportunities for entertainment. Spoiler, medieval weddings were rowdy, funerals were sometimes hilarious, and nothing was ever simple.
Home on their wedding night. Pots, pans, horns, shouting, you name it. The idea was partly to celebrate, partly to embarrass, and partly to make sure everyone knew that, yes, the marriage was being consummated. Imagine trying to start your married life while the entire neighborhood is banging pots outside your window. Romantic, right? If you were wealthy, your wedding looked very different. Nobles and royals used weddings as tools of diplomacy. The bride might be 12, the groom 14, neither of them particularly interested, and the whole point was to secure land or an alliance. Naturally, this came with a massive feast. And by massive, I mean tables groaning with roasted meats, fish pies, spiced wine, and pastries shaped like castles. If you've ever watched a medieval feast scene in a movie, you're not too far off. But what those movies leave out are the entertainment bits. Jesters cracking inappropriate jokes, minstrels singing about scandalous affairs, and sometimes even dwarfs or fools dressed in absurd costumes running around the hall. Subtlety was not the vibe. Oh, and guests were expected to eat until they physically couldn't anymore. There are records of people literally passing out from overeating at noble weddings. And you didn't just eat. Sometimes you played games. Wrestling matches might break out, archery contests, and of course, everyone got drunk. Imagine your cousin's modern wedding reception, but multiplied by 10 in terms of noise and chaos. Now let's slide, gently, slowly, into the other end of life. Funerals. You might think funerals in the Middle Ages were somber. Black clothing, quiet mourning, a priest sang prayers over the grave. And yes, that was technically the religious bit. But once again, the community got involved. And once again, things got weird. For peasants, funerals often turned into gatherings that looked suspiciously like feasts. You'd get together, eat bread, drink ale, and tell stories about the deceased. The line between mourning and merrymaking was blurry, sometimes dangerously so. There was a practice in parts of Europe known as the sin eater. Basically, a poor person would be hired to sit near the corpse, eat bread and drink ale over the body, symbolically consuming the dead person's sins so they could pass into the afterlife with a lighter soul. It was a weird, slightly creepy ritual, and naturally also kind of an excuse for people to hang around, watch, and gossip. And then there was the music.
Funerals often had processions with singers or chanters, but in some regions, this music could get almost festive. It wasn't all dirges. Sometimes people danced. Yes, danced at funerals. The medieval mindset around death was complicated. On one hand, everyone was terrified of purgatory. On the other, death was so common that mourning often blended with humor, storytelling, and, well, ale. Always ale. We also have records of mockery at funerals. Imagine a drunk neighbor making jokes about the deceased while the widow tries to keep a straight face. Or villagers performing little plays about morality, reminding everyone that we're all going to die soon too, so don't get too smug. It was both a warning and a kind of grim comedy. In noble funerals, meanwhile, things went full theater. Wax effigies of the deceased were paraded through the streets. Priests in elaborate vestments chanted for hours. Sometimes professional mourners were hired to wail loudly, because nothing says respect like paying someone to sob dramatically on cue. And the feasts that followed noble funerals? Almost indistinguishable from wedding feasts. Roasted swans, venison, exotic fruits if you could get them, rivers of wine. Mourning was hungry work, apparently. And in between weddings and funerals, we have the equally chaotic baptisms and christenings. You might expect these to be solemn: babies, holy water, the blessing of the priest, and sure, the ritual itself was quiet, but the after-party was not. Family and neighbors gathered, food was served, and people got drunk. Are you noticing a theme yet? One peculiar tradition was gossip songs. At christening feasts, guests sometimes sang verses predicting what the baby would grow up to be. Sometimes sweet, sometimes insulting. Imagine a group of drunk uncles singing, "This baby will be lazy. This baby will be fat. This baby will drink all the ale." Not exactly a Hallmark card. And just like weddings, christenings could involve charivari-style pranks. Neighbors might show up to make noise, sing bawdy songs, or even drag farm tools around the house to make a racket. Because apparently, no major life event in the Middle Ages was complete without embarrassing the family in public. Let's not forget the harvest and seasonal milestones. These weren't personal events like weddings or funerals, but they were absolutely central to community fun. Harvest festivals often included ale brewing competitions, bonfires, and even ritual games like climbing a greasy pole to grab a prize. Picture a group of villagers covered in mud trying to shimmy up a pole slicked with fat to grab a ham dangling from the top. Entertainment, medieval style. Winter, too, had its festivities. Yuletide meant feasting, caroling, and the infamous Lord of Misrule. A random person, often a servant or peasant, was chosen to play the role of temporary king during Christmas celebrations. They could order people around, make silly decrees, and generally turn the social order upside down for a few days. Naturally, this led to pranks, chaos, and sometimes genuine discomfort when the Lord of Misrule got a little too enthusiastic. So what do we learn from all this? That in the Middle Ages, life events weren't private, polite, or carefully controlled. They were loud, communal, and endlessly inventive. Weddings blurred into public spectacle. Funerals doubled as feasts. Christenings were half religious, half comedy roast sessions. And seasonal milestones became excuses to turn the world upside down for a while. When you lived in a world of short lifespans, uncertain harvests, and constant reminders of mortality, you grabbed any chance you could for celebration. And if that celebration involved embarrassing the bride, mocking the dead, or predicting your neighbor's baby would grow up to be an ale addict, well, all the better.
In the next part, we'll drift further into the games and pastimes of children and teenagers. What did kids in the Middle Ages do when they weren't working in fields or fetching water? Spoiler, it involves bones, mud, and games that would definitely give modern health and safety inspectors heart attacks. Alright, so picture this. You're 6 years old, it's the year 1327, and your favorite toy is a stick. That's it, just a stick. Maybe if you're lucky, it's a particularly good stick with a fork at the end so it can be both sword and slingshot. Welcome to childhood in the Middle Ages. Because as much as we love imagining children running around with toy knights and castles, the reality was a little less polished. Kids had fun, lots of fun, but their games were usually messy, improvised, and occasionally terrifying. Let's start with the simplest toys. Bones. Yes, bones. Sheep bones, mostly. Kids would use them like dice, tossing them on the ground in games not unlike modern jacks. Sometimes they even carved little faces or shapes into them. Archaeologists dig up these bone toys, which is both fascinating and slightly unsettling. Wood was another favorite material. Little carved animals, dolls, spinning tops. If Dad was handy with a knife, you might get a carved wooden knight. If Mom had scraps of cloth, you'd get a rag doll. Some dolls were shockingly detailed, complete with painted faces, jointed limbs, and even tiny furniture. Others were, well, a stick wrapped in cloth with 2 dots scratched in for eyes. Balls were common too. Made from stitched leather, stuffed with hair, straw, or rags. A pig's bladder could also do the trick. Inflate it, tie it off, and you've got a medieval balloon that doubles as a ball until it bursts in someone's face. Kids chased these around the village, in streets, fields, wherever there was space. And no, there were no rules, just chaos. Now let's wander into games. The most universal? Tag, or as they sometimes called it, prisoner's base. One kid chases another, everyone runs, someone gets caught, the cycle repeats. Children thousands of years apart, same game. Hide and seek was another favorite. Kids ducked behind haystacks, barns, bushes. Some medieval texts even mention hide and seek being played by teenagers and young adults, which is either adorable or slightly worrying depending on how seriously they took it. Then we get into the more physical stuff. Wrestling, mock sword fights with sticks, and that classic childhood pastime, hitting each other until someone cries. Boys especially loved pretending to be knights, which usually ended with bruises and splinters. And yes, girls played too, despite endless sermons about proper behavior. Kids loved imitating adults, which means they often played church. One child would be the priest, others the congregation. Sometimes they mimicked sermons, sometimes they sang, sometimes they turned it into comedy. Priests occasionally complained about this because apparently kids would mock their mannerisms a little too accurately. Other times, children staged mock weddings or mock trials. Again, imitating the adults, but with sillier outcomes. Imagine a group of 8-year-olds solemnly declaring that the family goat is guilty of stealing bread and sentencing it to exile behind the barn. But here's the thing. Childhood wasn't all play. Most kids had chores by the time they were 5 or 6. Fetching water, tending animals, helping in fields, spinning thread, carrying firewood. Their free time was limited, which probably made the play they did get even more energetic. You've spent all day shooing geese out of the neighbor's garden? Of course you're going to throw yourself into a mud wrestling match with your friends at dusk. And for poorer children, toys were even scarcer. A stick, a bone, a rag doll. That's it.
But that didn't stop them from making games out of everything. A pile of stones could become a castle. A puddle could be a battlefield. Fun was in the imagination, not the objects. Of course, medieval elites had very different toys. A noble child might own carved ivory chess sets, painted toy knights on horseback, miniature castles, silk puppets. They learned falconry and hunting for fun, not just for survival. They had tutors teaching them games of strategy, like chess, alongside music lessons. Basically, they got the deluxe toy package while peasant kids were still chasing inflated pig bladders. But here's the funny thing. When it came to outdoor games, noble kids and peasant kids weren't that different. They wrestled, raced, played tag, and threw snowballs too. Because some games are just universal. Doesn't matter if you're wearing rags or embroidered velvet, snow in the face feels the same. So, to sum up this little trip into childhood, medieval kids had fewer toys, riskier games, and way more chores. But they still found joy in the simplest things. Bones, sticks, songs, snow, mud. A reminder, maybe, that fun doesn't always need to come in a brightly colored box. And just like adults, children's fun was noisy, communal, and often chaotic. Games weren't about winning trophies, they were about burning off energy, teasing each other, and maybe breaking a few fingers along the way. In the next part, we'll wander into work and leisure for teenagers and young adults, because let's be real, once you hit about 12 in the Middle Ages, you weren't a child anymore. You were basically an adult in training, which meant your fun shifted. Less bone sword fights, more taverns, dancing, and, naturally, romance. So, you're 13 years old in the year 1400. Congratulations, you're basically an adult now. Childhood, such as it was, is officially over. You've been working for years already, but now you're expected to contribute even more. If you're a peasant boy, you're in the fields full time. If you're a girl, you're spinning, weaving, cooking, or helping raise younger siblings. If you're in a town, maybe you're an apprentice to a craftsman. But don't worry, even with all that responsibility, you still get to have fun. It's just fun of a slightly different flavor. Less stick-sword fights, more taverns, dancing, and, naturally, romance. Let's start with the obvious, the tavern. By your teenage years, you were absolutely welcome in the tavern. There was no drinking age, none. If you could carry a bucket of water, you could carry a mug of ale. And considering that ale was safer than water, most people started drinking young anyway. Taverns weren't just about drinking. They were social centers. Teenagers and young adults went there to listen to music, sing, gamble with dice, and swap gossip. If you were bold enough, maybe you flirted a little. The tavern was basically the medieval equivalent of hanging out at the mall, just with more fleas and fewer pretzels. But taverns weren't the only social outlet. Dancing was huge. And not the polite ballroom kind you're picturing from period dramas. Village dances were wild. Picture a circle of people stomping and clapping to bagpipes or fiddles, maybe holding hands, maybe just whirling around until they collapsed. Dancing was one of the rare socially acceptable ways for young men and women to interact, which means, of course, it was also one of the things the church constantly tried to regulate. Clerics wrote endless sermons about lewd dancing. Too close, too wild, too much temptation, which probably only made it more fun. When someone in authority tells you not to wiggle too enthusiastically at the summer fair, what are you going to do? Exactly. Wiggle harder. Speaking of temptation, let's talk about romance. For medieval teens, Courtship wasn't exactly candlelit dinners, but they found their ways. Village festivals, church feasts, dances, these were prime opportunities to meet people. Whispering during work, slipping away after chores, exchanging little tokens like ribbons or rings. In some regions, there were traditions that sound suspiciously like dating customs. For instance, in parts of Germany and the Low Countries, boys would serenade girls at night. Basically, medieval caroling, but with more hormones. Elsewhere, festivals had specific games designed to pair people up, like May Day celebrations where couples ran into the woods together, officially to gather flowers, unofficially, well, you can guess what. Parents and priests didn't always approve, of course, but in practice, communities tolerated a fair amount of youthful freedom, especially before marriage. Young adults were expected to sow a few wild oats, which they often did, enthusiastically. Now let's drift over to games and sports. Teenagers were old enough to join in the big, messy village football matches we talked about earlier, and yes, that meant full-on brawls, broken noses, sprained ankles, perfect teenage entertainment. Archery competitions were another popular pastime, especially in England, where laws required men to practice regularly. That meant village competitions, prizes, and a whole lot of showing off. Because nothing says impress the local girls like hitting a target at 200 paces while pretending you didn't spend all week practicing. Wrestling and quarterstaff fights were also common. Think of it as medieval mixed martial arts, only with wooden sticks. Crowds gathered to watch, bets were placed, and teenagers got to prove how tough they were. And then, of course, gambling. Dice, cards, which started spreading in Europe around the late Middle Ages, betting on animal fights, betting on who could climb a greasy pole fastest. If it involved chance, people were gambling on it. Teenagers were no exception. Many young men probably lost their week's wages in taverns before even making it home. Now, let's talk about festivals. If you were a teenager in the Middle Ages, festivals were your Disneyland. A few times a year, your whole community turned into a carnival. Traveling entertainers came through, jugglers, acrobats, musicians, markets buzzed with merchants selling exotic trinkets, and best of all, everyone loosened up. This was your chance to dance, to drink more freely, to mingle with people from nearby villages. Festivals gave young adults space to socialize outside the rigid structures of work and family, which is probably why the church kept warning about immorality during festivals. Because if you put a bunch of teenagers together with food, ale, music, and costumes, well, you can imagine how the night ended. And then there were the guilds. In towns, teenage apprentices often joined in guild festivals. Guilds, basically craft associations, loved to throw feasts, parades, and mystery plays. Imagine being 15, working all week as an apprentice shoemaker, and then suddenly you're dressed as a biblical shepherd in a play sponsored by the guild. Free food, costumes, applause. It beats scrubbing leather scraps all day. Guild feasts were also great equalizers. Masters, journeymen, and apprentices sat together, ate, and sometimes even competed in silly contests. For a brief evening, the harsh hierarchy of town life softened. Let's not forget about storytelling and songs. Teenagers weren't just passive listeners at these gatherings, they contributed. Singing bawdy songs in taverns, telling folk tales at festivals, joining in traveling plays. Many medieval songs that survive today, especially the more scandalous ones, probably circulated among the young first. You know, the medieval equivalent of sharing memes your parents definitely wouldn't approve of. And speaking of memes, graffiti was another outlet.
Yes, medieval teens carved doodles and jokes on walls, desks, and even church pews. Archaeologists have found everything from rude cartoons to inscriptions like, "I was here," scratched into stone. Human nature doesn't change much. So, of course, not all fun was harmless.
If you were lucky enough to be invited to one, or if you were rich enough to host one, feasts were the ultimate medieval entertainment. Picture long wooden tables piled with roasted meat, pies, stews, bread, and jugs of ale or wine. Minstrels played music, jugglers performed tricks, and sometimes there were even dancing bears. Feasts weren't just about eating, they were about showing off. Lords used them to display wealth and generosity. Guilds threw feasts to celebrate holy days. Villages held them after successful harvests. Even weddings doubled as community feasts, with everyone piling in to dance, sing, and, naturally, embarrass the bride and groom with bawdy songs. And let's not pretend people were dainty about it. Forks were rare, spoons were common, but most food was eaten with hands. Wiping your greasy fingers on the nearest dog? Totally acceptable.
Think about it. If you were an old woman, you might teach younger girls how to spin wool, embroider, or cook. If you were an old man, you might show boys how to carve wood or sharpen tools. These were productive lessons, but they also doubled as leisure, slow, steady tasks done with plenty of chatting. And let's be honest, gossip was practically an Olympic sport among the elderly. You'd see them sitting on benches, leaning on canes, offering a running commentary on who was courting whom, which harvest failed, and whether the priest's sermons were getting shorter or longer. But old age didn't mean giving up on games. Elderly people still played. Board games like Nine Men's Morris or dice could be enjoyed while sitting by the fire. Card games, once they arrived in Europe, spread across all ages. These games weren't just entertainment, they were mental exercise, social bonding, and yes, sometimes a chance to win a coin or two. And let's not underestimate their competitiveness. A 60-year-old farmer who'd lived through 3 bad harvests and a civil war was not going to lose a dice game lightly. Now, about festivals. Elders might not dance as wildly as the youth, but they were still part of the celebration. They joined processions, sang hymns, clapped along to music, and enjoyed the spectacle. Some even danced, slowly perhaps, but proudly. Festivals also offered a chance for old folks to sit back, drink, and watch younger generations make fools of themselves. Picture a grandmother cackling as young men try to climb a greased pole, or an old farmer shaking his head at teenagers getting drunk on weak ale. Entertainment doesn't always mean doing. Sometimes it's just watching. And yes, there were quieter forms of fun. For example, gardening. Elderly people often tended small gardens of herbs or flowers. Herbs weren't just for medicine. They were fragrant, colorful, and soothing to tend. A well-kept garden was both a source of pride and a pleasant way to pass time. Then there was crafting. Some elders carved wood, whittled toys, or wove baskets. Others embroidered or mended clothes. These weren't high-energy tasks, but they were satisfying, creative, and often appreciated by younger family members. Reading was another quiet leisure, though limited to those who were literate, usually clergy or retired scribes. Still, if you were an old monk, your idea of fun might genuinely be copying manuscripts in peace and sipping watered-down wine. Not glamorous, but certainly calming. And of course, we can't ignore the role of drinking. Old people drank too. Taverns weren't just for rowdy youths, they were also gathering spots for elders. A few mugs of ale, some gossip, a dice game, maybe even singing a few old ballads. Imagine the tavern corner, 3 white-haired veterans arguing about whose oxen was strongest back in 1322. That's medieval nightlife at its coziest. One surprising leisure pursuit for the elderly was mentoring younger community members. This wasn't just about teaching skills, it was about telling people how to behave. If you were an elder, you had the authority to comment on village customs, settle disputes, or remind hot-headed youths not to do anything too stupid. Did the youths listen? Probably not. But for the elderly, offering advice and commentary was practically a hobby. And finally, let's talk about the philosophical side of fun. Elderly people sometimes leaned into more reflective forms of leisure. They wrote or dictated memoirs. They shared wisdom about seasons, farming, or faith. They meditated, prayed, or simply sat outdoors, enjoying the sun. In many ways, leisure for the elderly wasn't about excitement anymore. It was about connection. Staying close to family, watching the community grow, and taking part in traditions. Their fun wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into it, slower but no less meaningful. So, to sum it up, the elderly in the Middle Ages weren't sidelined into boredom. They told stories, played games, gardened, drank, mentored, laughed at festivals, and clung to both tradition and gossip with equal passion. Leisure evolved with age. Childhood meant games. Teens meant chaos. Adults meant feasts and festivals. And old age meant wisdom sharing and quiet enjoyment. Each stage had its own rhythms, but all of them included joy. And with that, we have reached the end of our long, meandering stroll through medieval fun. From pig bladder football to grandmother's gossip bench, we've seen that the Middle Ages weren't all doom and gloom. They were full of laughter, games, and human moments. So, if you've stayed awake through this entire journey, congratulations. If you've fallen asleep, even better. That was the point. Now dim the lights. Close your eyes and dream of maypole dances, tavern songs, and maybe, just maybe, a dice game you're destined to win. Good night.